Story number 1. But the man in the cornfield. The cornfield stretched endlessly behind the old farmhouse, its rows tall and dense, swaying gently in the autumn breeze. For years the Miller family had tended it without incident. But things changed the year they found the scarecrow. It wasn't theirs. One chilly October morning, Tom Miller spotted it while walking the rows. It stood in the middle of the field, much taller than any scarecrow they had ever used, its frame hunched as if weighed down by the tattered black cloak that hung from its shoulders. Its head was a burlap sack stuffed with straw, with crudely painted eyes and a crooked stitched grin. Tom assumed it was a prank, maybe kids from town messing around. He shrugged it off and returned to the house. That night, as the family sat at dinner, a tapping sound echoed from the back door. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of conversation, but it grew louder, more insistent. Tom grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The wind had picked up, rustling the cornfield, but no one was there. He scanned the rows with the beam of light, his stomach twisting when he realized the scarecrow was no longer in the field. Probably fell over, he muttered to himself, heading back inside. But the tapping continued every night after that, always at the same time. By the third night, the family was on edge. Tom's wife, Ellen, suggested they call the sheriff, but Tom waved her off. "It's just kids," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, the tapping came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, Tom was ready. He grabbed his shotgun and stormed outside, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The cornfield loomed in the darkness, a wall of swaying stalks. He could feel it watching him. "Who's out there?" he shouted. There was no response, only the sound of the wind. As he stepped closer to the edge of the field, the beam of his flashlight caught something, a shape moving between the rows. "Hey!" he yelled, chasing after it. He pushed through the stalks, the dry leaves cutting at his arms. The shape darted deeper into the field, always just out of reach. Finally, he burst into a clearing. The scarecrow was there, standing impossibly tall in the moonlight. But something was wrong. Its head was turned slightly, as if it had been watching him approach. The grin stitched onto the burlap seemed wider now, almost mocking. Tom backed away slowly, his heart hammering. Then, with a shuddering motion, the scarecrow tilted its head. It moved. Tom fired the shotgun, the sound deafening in the stillness. The scarecrow staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it took a lurching step forward. Tom ran. When he reached the house, he bolted the doors and windows, his chest heaving. "What happened?" Ellen asked, her face pale. "It's not a prank," he managed to say, his voice trembling. That night, the tapping didn't come from the back door. It came from the windows. The family huddled in the living room, every light in the house blazing. The sound moved from window to window, deliberate and rhythmic, as if something was circling the house. Then it stopped. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until a loud crash shattered it. The back door had been kicked in. Tom grabbed his shotgun and stood in front of Ellen and their daughter, Sarah. "Stay behind me," he whispered. From the hallway, a shadow stretched across the floor, long and distorted. The air grew colder and the faint smell of straw filled the room. The scarecrow appeared in the doorway, its head scraping against the frame. Up close, its burlap face was worse than Tom remembered. Its eyes seemed to glisten now, dark and alive, and the grin pulsed as if it were breathing. Tom fired again. The scarecrow staggered, but instead of falling, it let out a guttural, wet sound. A laugh. It lunged. The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. Ellen screamed, Sarah cried, and Tom swung the shotgun like a club, but it was useless. When the neighbors came by the next morning, the Miller family was gone. The house was silent, the back door hanging open. In the middle of the cornfield, the scarecrow stood tall once again. But now its grin was wider, and its eyes looked disturbingly human. Story number 2. The Forgotten Room. When the Thompson family moved into the old house on Sycamore Street, they were thrilled. The home was a Victorian masterpiece with stained glass windows, carved wooden banisters, and a sprawling backyard. It was a dream come true, until they found the door. The door was in the basement behind a pile of rotting crates. It was small, barely 5 feet tall, and made of aged wood that seemed older than the house itself. Unlike the other doors, it had no knob, only a rusty keyhole. "What do you think it's for?" Grace, the eldest daughter, asked as they all stared at it. "Probably just an old storage room," her father said. But something about the door unsettled them all. Over the next few weeks, the family settled in, busy with unpacking and fixing up the house. Yet, no matter how much work they did, the basement always felt wrong. The air was colder there, heavy with a faint metallic smell, and sometimes when the house was silent, they swore they could hear faint noises from behind the door. One night, Grace decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, she crept down the basement stairs. Her parents had forbidden her from messing with the door, but curiosity gnawed at her. She had found an old skeleton key in the attic and was eager to see if it fit. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. As she turned it, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward. The air that wafted up was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of earth and decay. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing. No answer. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The staircase descended further than she expected, and the deeper she went, the darker it became. The walls were lined with damp stone, and water dripped somewhere in the distance. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a small room. It was empty except for a single chair in the center. The chair was wooden, its legs uneven, and it faced the far wall. Scratched into the wall were words, barely legible in the dim light. "Do not turn around." A chill ran down Grace's spine. She backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The air seemed heavier now, pressing down on her chest. And then she heard it. A faint, wet breathing sound. It came from behind her. Her heart raced as she froze in place, remembering the words on the wall. She didn't dare turn around, even as the sound grew louder, closer. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice whispered, so close it tickled her ear. "Why did you open the door?" Grace screamed and bolted up the stairs, her flashlight swinging wildly. She didn't stop until she reached the basement, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She never told her parents what happened, but she avoided the basement from then on. The noises began that same night. Scratching. Faint at first, but growing louder each day. Footsteps echoed through the house at odd hours, even when everyone was accounted for. Lights flickered and the air grew colder. One evening, her younger brother Jake wandered into the basement. He was only 6 and didn't understand why Grace was so scared of the door. He found the key where she had hidden it and unlocked the door himself. When Grace realized he was missing, she ran downstairs, her parents close behind. The door stood ajar. "Jake!" her mother called, panic rising in her voice. They descended the staircase, Grace trembling as she led the way. The small room at the bottom was empty, but the chair was different now. It faced the staircase. On it sat Jake's teddy bear, its stuffing ripped out and scattered across the floor. Jake was nowhere to be found. They searched the entire house and the woods beyond, but there was no sign of him. The police were called, but the investigation turned up nothing. Eventually, the case went cold. The Thompsons moved out a month later, unable to bear the weight of the tragedy. Years passed, and the house remained empty. Local children whispered stories about the basement door, claiming they could hear scratching and faint whispers if they got too close. One night, decades after the Thompsons had left, the house was purchased by a young couple. As they explored the basement, they found the door. Curious, they opened it. And deep below the house, in the small stone room, they found the chair. It faced the far wall again, and carved into the stone beneath the original warning were fresh words. "He's still here." Story number 3. The Face in the Window. When Claire moved into the small countryside cottage, she was thrilled to finally have a place of her own. It was quaint, tucked away in a quiet village surrounded by rolling hills and thick woods. She had inherited it from her great-aunt Margaret, a relative she barely remembered who had lived alone for decades. The cottage had charm, low ceilings, a stone fireplace, and ivy creeping up the exterior. But what Claire loved most was the massive window in the living room. It faced the forest, and during the day sunlight streamed in, painting the room with golden warmth. The first week was blissful. She spent her days unpacking and exploring the surrounding countryside. But as night fell on her 8th day, something felt off. It started with a noise, a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Claire paused, her heart skipping a beat, and looked around. It was coming from the living room. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the window. Nothing but darkness beyond it. The forest was a wall of black, impenetrable. She couldn't see anything, but the tapping continued. She flipped on the porch light, illuminating the area outside the window. There was no one there. Claire laughed nervously, chalking it up to tree branches brushing against the glass. She pulled the curtains shut and went to bed. The tapping didn't return until the next night. This time it was louder, more insistent. Claire crept into the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She peeked through the curtains, but the porch light revealed nothing, just the empty yard and the edge of the woods. But when she turned off the light, letting the darkness take over, she saw it. A face. Pressed against the glass, pale and indistinct. The features were blurred, like an unfinished painting, but its eyes gleamed unnaturally, catching what little light there was. Claire stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. When she dared to look again, the face was gone. The next morning, she examined the window in daylight. There were no smudges, no signs of anyone having been there. She tried to convince herself it had been a trick of her tired mind. But deep down, she knew better. Over the following nights, the tapping grew more frequent. The face would appear sporadically, always at the edge of the glass, watching her. It didn't move or make a sound. It just stared. Claire called the local authorities, but when they came to investigate, they found nothing. Probably animals, they said. Or kids playing pranks. But Claire knew it wasn't that. One night, as she sat in the living room with the curtains drawn tight, the tapping stopped abruptly. A moment later, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why won't you look at me?" Her stomach dropped. The next text came immediately after. "I'm inside." Claire's blood ran cold as the faint creak of a floorboard echoed from behind her. She didn't dare turn around. Slowly she reached for her phone to call for help. The voice came then, low and whispering, right by her ear. "I just want to see you." Claire screamed and bolted for the door, running out into the cold night. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest neighbor's house. By the time the police arrived, the cottage was empty. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. Claire never returned to the cottage. The new owners, however, reported strange occurrences almost immediately. Tapping at the windows, fleeting glimpses of a pale face, and the sensation of being watched. And sometimes, late at night, a soft voice whispering from the darkness, "Why won't you look at me?"